European Union Studies Center here at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Welcome to the first installment of our three-part series on Weimar and Us, Lessons for Today from Interwar Germany. Given the frequency with which the comparison is made, we thought it might be illuminating to examine possible similarities as well as differences between our own situation and that of Weimar Germany, which famously had a brief but storied life between 1918 and 1933, but vanished as the Nazis came to power in that year. Remember, let me remind you that there are two more events like this coming in the next 3 weeks, a week from now, on Wednesday night, in fact, in this building, although not in this room. We'll have the next installment with David Abraham, who's been good enough to come to this evening's event, and on October 30th with Sherry Berman from Barnard College. The idea for the series came to us as we pondered the call of the German embassy to apply for funding on Germany-themed topics from its Germany on Campus program. We applied and received the grant that is covering the expenses of our distinguished invited speakers. I want to begin, therefore, by thanking the German Embassy for its support of these events. I must also thank the DAAD Alumni Association, that is to say the German Academic Exchange Services Alumni Association, and its president, Manfred Philipp, for their support in publicizing these events to relevant audiences. I finally want to thank a number of people around me here at the Graduate Center, without whose help these events simply would not be possible. They are at the EU Studies Center and the Ralph Bunche Institute, Eli Karetny, our administrative director, who does battle with the bureaucracy, bless his heart, Lukasz Szelminski, who's the associate director of the EU Studies Center, and Juan Acevedo, who solves all sorts of problems, I don't know how, while doing his doctoral research and speaking perfect Chinese, which, and while he's studying, he's a Colombian by origin, native speaker of Spanish, doing his doctoral research in English, and a lot of it's about China. So, but in any case, let me now introduce our speakers. Isabel Hull is, I may mispronounce your namesake, the namesake of your chair, but John Stambaugh, Professor Emerita of History and the former chair of the History Department at Cornell University. She specializes, as I'm sure you all know, in German history from 1700 to 1945, with a focus on sociopolitics, political theory, and gender and sexuality. Beginning in January 2006, she served for a number of years on the editorial board of the Journal of Modern History. She's the author of many books and articles, perhaps most prominently of the books Absolute Destruction, Military Culture and the Practices of War in Imperial Germany, published by Cornell University Press in 2005, and A Scrap of Paper, Breaking and Making International Law During the Great War, published in 2014, also by Cornell University Press. Professor Hull is a recipient of the Ralph Waldo Emerson Award of Phi Beta Kappa, and in 1996 of the Leo Gershoy Award, which is awarded by the American Historical Association to the best book on the history of Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. She's a member of the American Academy of Sciences, has been a Guggenheim Fellow, and has also been an Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung Research Fellow. In 2013, she was awarded the inaugural International Research Support Prize by the Max Weber Stiftung and the Historisches Kolleg. And I have to say, I'm delighted that she so readily accepted my invitation to come. I barely had to nudge her, and she immediately said that she would come, and that was fantastic. So after some opening remarks, she will engage in a conversation with our own Professor Steve Remy, who's taught modern European history at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center since 2002. He teaches courses in modern European and German history, Nazi Germany, the politics and culture of memory in 20th century Europe, colonial wars, and historical methodology. Professor Remy is author of a number of books, including The Heidelberg Myth, The Nazification and Denazification of a German University, published by Harvard University Press in 2003, and which examined the responses of scholars to National Socialism, and The Malmedy Massacre, the war crimes trial controversy in 2017, also by Harvard. That book deals with debates over war crimes trials in the US and Germany. His most recent book is War Crimes, Law, Politics, and Armed Conflict in the Modern World, published in 2023 by Taylor and Francis. And we're, again, very pleased that he was able to join us for this conversation. I really appreciate you doing this, Steve. So I now turn the floor over to Professors Hull and Remy. Thank you for joining us, and please come back for the next two events on the 16th, a week from tonight, and Wednesday, October 30th. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's delightful to be here. And I accepted so readily because I've actually been thinking a lot about this subject. And I thought, oh, this is an opportunity to actually be a little more systematic about it. And I was happy to do that. As you all, I'm sure, know, valid historical comparisons are based, function if the greatest number of similarities exist between the two things that you're comparing. And that permits you to hold things constant, and that permits you therefore to have a much more acute analysis of what the differences are. And I was assigned the military, although I'm more familiar with the Wilhelminian military than the Weimar military, although they're the same guys, but and in the problem with this, as I'll explain, is that the comparison concerning at least two major questions that obviously come to mind don't work very well because the dissimilarities are much greater than the similarities. And these two things are the question of political violence and the role of the military and paramilitary groups in fomenting them or quashing them. The second point is the issue of coup d'etat, actually taking over by force or stopping a takeover by force. And in both of those things, I think that the differences far outweigh the similarities. Which would focus, in my view, our attention on Gleichschaltung, on coordination or the consolidation of power once it was achieved in whatever way it might have been achieved. Nevertheless, I think that comparisons, even when they're not perfect, are really useful because they focus your attention on things, they raise really interesting questions, and even when you discover that they don't work, it might relieve you enough to look at where they do, which is kind of what I hope might happen tonight. So those are the three things that I'll actually be focusing on. And I had not knowing who would show up tonight, I thought, well, I would better ask the audience if you need a primer on the fall of the Weimar Republic. And I'm looking out at all these Germanists and I think, no, they certainly don't need that. But if there is anybody, does everybody feel fit in Weimar history? Yeah, pretty much. So let me just say this. Has it ever occurred to you to wonder why, if you really think about the sort of the fall of the Weimar Republic, most people would date it from September 1930th, and you would certainly end it at August 2nd, 1934, when Hitler put the Reichskanzlerschaft and the presidency in the same boat, okay? So certainly by that time, everybody would agree, yes, it's consolidated, it's gleichgeschaltet. Doesn't it strike you as interesting that something that at the beginning of that process had only existed for a mere 10 years, that it took 4 years to do this. That had never occurred to me before, and I actually think that's a very interesting idea because, of course, the temptation is to say that Weimar could only have succeeded under the most extraordinary economic and international political conditions. And so the question is, why did it take 4 years to get rid of it? So we might go back to a question like that, which I must say had never occurred to me before I thought about this talk. So let me begin with the question of the army, the paramilitaries, and political violence. And as I've said, I think here the comparisons are least good. In fact, and I have some slides I can show you if you want, but you don't need to see them. But the point of this is that the ratio of the army to the paramilitary groups is almost exactly perfectly reversed. In the Weimar Republic, the paramilitaries outnumbered the military by about a factor of 12 to 1. And in the United States, it's the reverse. And we can go into those figures and what's how reliable they are or whatever. We can do that. But nonetheless, it is very striking that they are in fact almost exactly completely reversed. The nature of the political violence is also quite different. In the Weimar Republic, it was very organized. It is mostly done by groups. In the United States, political violence appears mostly to be done by individuals. Some of them are members of groups, but they often act individually. And that's also a very interesting difference, and one which makes it, I think, harder for the authorities to do something about that, if you think about it in that way. There's another big difference, and that is that in the Weimar Republic, it wasn't just the right wing that was into political violence, it was also the left wing, which was large-ish and well-organized and very active, and that cannot be said in the United States, despite what the Republican Party is fond of saying. In fact, there barely is a real left wing in the United States by European standards anyway. And so that's a major difference as well. There is, however, an interesting similarity that we might discuss, and that is the claim that many people make that right-wing violence is somehow patriotic and national and therefore excusable when left-wing violence is subversive and revolutionary and therefore scary and not. And you find that kind of attempt to interpret what's going on in both places. That's equally present. So those are some things to think about in the first thing. On coup attempts, this again doesn't look like, the two cases don't look very similar. In Weimar, the coup attempts are really from 1919 to 1920 and then again in 1923. And in terms of the army defends the Republic then, and against the left and also against the right. But it had to use the Freikorps to do that because it had so few actual members of the military. During the Kapp Putsch in 1920, the army actually splits, and some army units are in favor of the Kapp Putsch, and others are not. And so the army is somewhat equivocal, but on the whole, in the end, the army tended to defend the Republic at in those moments in which coups and organized paramilitary violence were most prevalent. It's also interesting that to remember that, which I'm sure you all do, that after 1923 failed at the Bierhall Putsch in Munich, Hitler decided to come to power by legal seeming means. So he abandons the idea of a coup, although it recurs. You can see it. There are plans for it in various places, but in any event. Okay, we've had one such attempt in our 248-year history, and that was, of course, on January 6th, 2021. And that is really interesting to look at in detail when you ask the question, why was the Army, the National Guard, so late in being called up? There's a 3-hour, 19-minute gap. And the main source that I was able to find that goes into this is the January 6th committee report, which I recommend to you if you haven't looked at it. The first 2 appendices are on this issue. And we might want to discuss what went on there in greater detail, because I find it very interesting. The upshot of January, and there are actually more, there are actually very interesting parallels between the organization and disorganization of paramilitary groups in 1919, 1920, and 1923 on the one hand, and January 6th on the other, which nobody appears to have looked at, but they're very striking when you do look at them. But the failure of that, I think we should probably imagine that the folks, the paramilitary guys, are going to do something different the next time and in different places. So we could talk about that. The third thing where I've indicated that I think that we really, that's a much more interesting comparison is Gleichschaltung, the coordination or consolidation of power. And that would, of course, happen in our case if Trump were elected. And then the question is, what happens then? And what does that look like? And there are really 2 methods that in the Weimar Republic occurred simultaneously and in oscillation with one another. And one was the legal seeming stuff. And the other was state-sanctioned or state-sponsored or state-permitted violence, political violence against opponents. And let me just sketch this out, because this might not be actually in the forefront of your minds, despite all of your prodigious knowledge about the Weimar Republic. Under the legal seeming things, the Reichstag fire decree ended civil rights. It outlawed the Communist Party, and leaders and others were immediately arrested. It restricted certain freedoms that the socialists enjoyed. It expanded the death penalty from any thing that was punished by life imprisonment could now be subject to the death penalty. And it's part of this effort to, or it echoes the effort to consolidate power at the top at the expense of other sources of power, and that, of course, destroys separation of powers and therefore destroys democracy, since that's one of 3 main things I think that are important in the definition of democracy. The Enabling Act, which has sometimes been called the kind of constitution of the Third Reich, insofar as it had one, was passed by 2/3 of the parties in the Reichstag. The KPD was gone. The SPD voted against it for the most part, and the other parties voted for it, with SA guys around threatening everybody, standing inside the Reichstag. So the actual vote, you should ask, gee, was that a legal vote or not? And I would say it was not. The The name of the act is interesting, an act to relieve the distress of the people and of the Reich. That's its actual thing. And basically what it did was it made the cabinet the legislative branch. The legislative branch was in essence bracketed, and the cabinet became the capable of doing legislation, of making laws, which, and this was explicit in it, which contravened the Constitution. Okay, so that's right there in the act. And the only exception was that the Reichstag and the Reichsrat, which is sort of like the state, the representatives of the state, were supposedly not to be touched by this, but that, of course, was not going to be true. The Reichstag was to pass laws only in exceptional circumstances, and and the whole thing was supposed to expire in 1937 when it was renewed. It was renewed again in 1942, and so it's the thing that permits the consolidation of power at the top, at the expense of the legislature, and removes for good the separation of powers. That's it, and this is done very quickly. The power of the president was not to be curtailed. That's part of that act. And what this did was actually make Hitler independent of Hindenburg. That is, the chancellor was independent of the president, and that's important too, because he's now, again, just bracketed. So all you have to do is now wait for him to die, which he conveniently does in a little over a year. And these were followed by the Reichsaufbaugesetz of 1934, which abolished the states. So for the one and only time in Germany's history, it had a central government, and they're gone. The Reichsrat Act of 1934 abolished that, and so that's out. So all of these things look like, they're called laws, they look like laws, they have the patina of legality, but in fact what they do is undo everything. In terms of violence, this all depends on how you weigh this, and I don't want to seem callous, but by the 5th of March, there were already 60 people dead. By October 1933, there were between 500 and 600 people dead. There were 26,000 people who were imprisoned permanently, and there were another 200,000 who had been cycled through concentration camps, which were set up from the bottom, not from the top. They're set up by the local SS guys and so on. So there's a fair amount of violence. Reuters says that between January 6th, 2021 and July 2023, so 18 months, there were 18 political deaths in the United States, which has a population 5 times that of the Weimar Republic, which is to say, I don't, again, want to denigrate the political violence in the United States, but it's really not comparable to what was going on in the Weimar Republic. Okay. If you look at Project 2025, the unitary executive theory would in fact change the Constitution. And it would change the Constitution in ways that ought to sound really familiar now that I've gone through the Enabling Act for you. The federal bureaucracy would come under executive control. There would be no job protections for civil servants who would become all political appointees. The FBI and the Department of Justice would be reduced. The Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission, which is to say in economics and in the media, that would now fall under the executive, under presidential control. The separation of church and state would be eliminated in favor of something called Christian values in government. For us dealing with the military, the military would, the Project 2025 calls for the deployment of, quote, the military for domestic law enforcement, unquote, which they specify to mean getting rid of legal immigrants. And of course, the Army is not supposed to be used by that. And we could talk about Article 48 versus the Insurrection Act in the United States. That's an interesting subject to look at in this. The Department of Justice and the FBI are going to be used to prosecute, quote, conspirators, unquote, which means political opponents. And there will be an increase in the use of capital punishment. And all of those things should go ding-a-ling-a-ling, ding-a-ling-a-ling, ding-a-ling-a-ling. So the question then becomes, who will protect us from that? Okay, the Army, sheriffs, police department, mass demonstrations, general strike, like what ended the cop putsch in 1920. Those are some of the things that I think we could usefully discuss. So that's it for me, at the beginning anyway.
Thank you, Professor Hull. That's a lot to think about. Is this too loud? Seem like I'm shouting? Okay. There are a whole number of things going through my head right now. I maybe could start with your impressions on some of the bigger picture here about comparisons. I mean, for a long time, as you know, and I think probably everybody here knows, that the Weimar Republic was treated by historians as really not much more than a precursor to the Nazi period. It was all going in that direction, and so treated as this tragedy. And then the big turn takes place, and it's treated as history and on its own terms historically. Do you think that we're in some ways going back when it comes to these comparisons to a version of the older model, this kind of teleological, this is direction we're going in? Your comments actually made me think that no, we're not. This is a much more we're at a much more sophisticated place in terms of our abilities to think about the similarities and the major differences in different contexts.
Do it either?
Green
You
light.
can do it.
Green light.
All right, excellent. Yeah, although I was brought up a Calvinist, I don't believe in predetermination. So I am unhappy with teleological stuff. And I think that if you go back and read about Weimar, it is really astonishing how much depended from September 1930 to the appointment of Hitler in the end of January 1933, how much depended on individuals and who whispered in whose ears. And it really is a conspiracy of a very few people. If you switch out any of them, if you give President von Hindenburg a little better health at certain points, things look different. It's really quite extraordinary that way. And I think it's always more useful, and I'm speaking just as an historian, that you don't imagine that you wind it up and it just locksteps its way over the cliff, either the Weimar Republic or anything else. And so from that perspective, that would be my take on things. And I do think that the comparative history there's been a lot of really good work on various comparisons all over the place. And so I think that we're in perhaps a more sophisticated, we've thought a little bit more acutely about how you do a comparison and what makes a valid comparison and stuff than perhaps was true earlier.
Right. So let's get into the weeds maybe a little bit then, and some of your the particulars of some of your comments. And I don't have a particular order in mind, but my in listening to you, my mind kept going to the question of military relations and civilian oversight of the military, and this idea that one of the biggest differences between the two is that in the United States, you have this long, well-established tradition of the military staying out of domestic politics. But the question is, it's much murkier in the case of the Republic, as you pointed out. So in as much thinking as you've done about German military culture and different regimes, would you care to apply that thinking to the U.S. case? I mean, it's extraordinary, I think, how well the United States military establishment did in the Trump presidency. I'm thinking in particular of Mark Milley, but one of the things that's so unnerving about that was that what if there's not a Mark Milley in a future Trump presidency?
Okay, there are two parts to this, and I'll answer the second one first. With the caveat, folks, remember, I'm an American, but I'm not an American historian. And my knowledge of Germany is better than my knowledge of the United States. My knowledge of the United States is currently much better than it was a month ago, but nevertheless, just remember that. So it's certainly true that the United States military has an unbroken, from Washington, I mean, an unbroken record of keeping its nose out of politics. Milley's interesting because he stumbled with that Lafayette Square nonsense with the upside down Bible. And he immediately learned from that. And actually, he entered into a very long, repeated conversation over a long period of time with Nancy Pelosi. And I would love to see the transcript of that. And he then became much more aware of the necessity to reiterate, which he did again and again and again, that in the United States Army, you must not fulfill an order which is illegal. And Lloyd Austin has also repeated that again and again and again in an effort to inoculate the lower downs and down farther and farther and farther. So from that perspective, the U.S. Army is robust in that respect, but you should also sort of have in your head the difficulty an officer has if a president orders him to do something, and can back it up by, say, congressional support, or by being able even remotely plausibly to maintain that there is some kind of an emergency of security. That's you're asking a lot of people, and we shouldn't forget that, regardless of the excellent history and useful history of the United States military. I find myself actually disagreeing with a lot of the literature, and this is the second part, with a lot of the literature on the political finagling of the German army. On the whole, the German army didn't like to do that. Its general history does not show many examples of that. If you look at the Prussian army, if you look at the others, the Saxon army, the Bavarian army, and the Baden army, you don't see any of it. In the Prussian army, you have to go back to Napoleon, and you might recall General von York, who went over to the Russians and basically announced I'm doing this because I'm going to help save Germany, help save Prussia and help save Germany. But the only way I can do it is by going to the other side. So there you have an instance of major disobedience that is politically motivated. And you can think of the enormously enlightened people like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and wie sie alle heißen in this same period, who are highly political, or even Clausewitz for that matter, that they are political, but they're not fiddling politically in the manner in which we sort of think of things. You don't get real political finagling by the military until August of 1916 in the First World War, with Hindenburg and Ludendorff together. And even that is pretty namby-pamby, in my view, or ineffective or amateurish, and off again, on again, Flanagan. And when you get into the Weimar period, both von Seeckt and Gröner were passionately in favor of keeping the army out of politics. And actually, anticipating your question, I have a quotation from this. Here's Gröner's response to the to Hitler's attempt after 1929 to woo the army and its soldiers. It is the sacred task of the Wehrmacht to prevent social conflict and civil war. It has no other interest and no other task than service to the state. And therefore it must avoid completely any kind of sort of marriage with a party. And Seeckt said virtually the same thing. And there are nuances and things that rightly you can talk about and wonder about, especially in the case of Seeckt, and much less so in the case of Gröner, who was his successor, and who was then thrown out in 1932. But in fact, the army tries to stay out of politics, and this is it's a very it's schwammig, it's spongy, it's difficult, and it was hard for them, and it's hard to reconstruct in sort of looking back. But the short course in the end is they go along. That's the point, is that they go along. And they go along because they are pressed. They are much more alive to the danger well, not proposed, but what's the word? The danger that exists from the KPD. And so they're happy to crush those guys. They're clearly less happy about crushing the Nazis. They're also less sure they can actually do it successfully, which is, you have to bear that in mind as well. And in the end, Hitler buys them off with rearmament and with crushing the Sturmabteilung, the SA, so that they sit with their hands in their laps when Ernst Röhm and over 100 or more people are murdered by the SS, with the partial connivance actually of some army units at the bottom. And those murders included the murders of two generals, Kurt von Schleicher and Gerd von Bredow. So they actually signed off on that. And the quid pro quo was getting rid of the SA, which was understood to be a rival, correctly, of the army on the one hand and rearmament on the other. So they could be had, and they were. And by the time they woke up to this, to the problems, which they began to do after November 1937, it was too late. And we could talk about that, but I think it's a much more complicated
Mhm.
story
Yeah.
than is sometimes said.
So you mentioned Civil War, and I've been sort of dying to ask you this and get this into the discussion. The extent to which fears of civil war, real, imagined, exaggerated, invented during the Weimar Republic, seems to me to be all over the place in politics and in the culture of the Reichswehr and in the
Mhm.
combat leagues. And of course, now it's all over the discourse in the United States. I mean, we have this big budget feature film this summer, which I confess I did not have the courage to watch. It just I was just thought it might be too terrifying. But this is one of those issues that in which I'm not necessarily thinking of a direct comparison, but discourse and rhetoric about the fears of civil war seems really important in the Weimar Republic, in driving politics and in generating political fear. What's your take on that fear, real and imagined?
It's real, I would say, and it plays a really interesting role in its strongest in 1919 and 1920, which makes sense because you're just setting things up. The left is very strong. It's strong enough to try its own little putches in various places, not just in Berlin. The army is faced with the problem that it is reduced to 100,000. Maybe I could show you, just so you see it. It's really oh, and here I'm gonna screw this up, I'm sure. What is it that I'm supposed to punch here? If I do this, will that work? No, damn
Luke,
it. I've forgotten what thing I am supposed to do to get this on, because it's really very striking. Oh, that one over there. Okay, great. So let me go down this way. Forget the elections. There. The army is the very bottom-most thing here. And all of the paramilitary groups are stacked on top. And you can see why, if you were a military man, you would hesitate to want to provoke a civil war, to go in and actually try to end something, simply because you didn't have enough guys. There are over 1 million guys who are ranged potentially against you, or who can, depending on what it is. Here, there's another way to look at this, like this, that the army is the red, it stays at 100,000, and you can see the change over time. But the point of the Stahlhelm is the right-wing veterans organization. The Jungdeutscher Orden is another one of those. The SA is the Nazis. So this just shows you the right-wing ones. But the interesting thing about Civil War was that the army was equally alive to the idea that you could have a civil war coming from the right, not just from the left. Their preference was to knock out the guys on the left and then do something, and they're not quite sure what, with the right. And in the end, Hitler solves that for them by the Night of the Long Knives at the end of June 1934, and basically getting rid of the SA. But the really interesting thing that happens is that in rearmament, you have to get people from someplace, right? If you're going to rearm and expand the military. And what they actually managed to do is to suck in all of these people anyway into the army, and they in fact are this narrow little formerly Wilhelminian officer corps, which is more sort of conservative, is actually swamped by lower ranking soldiers and lower ranking officers, NCOs and soldiers who are profoundly right wing. And they actually, it can, I think, be correctly argued, lose control of the army that way. So it's very complicated. And there's, I guess, one other really interesting thing to think about that people have argued in July 1932, the von Papen government overthrew the Prussian government. And they did that because that was the last pro-Republican, run by the Social Democratic Party government. It's 3/5 of Germany, and it has 50,000 policemen who are, yeah. And so if you add 50,000 is 1/2 the strength of the army, okay? So the army would like to have those guys. And what happens with them, with the Prussian police, is they're purged at the top. And so the pro-Republican socialist police chiefs all over the place, and those guys are instantly thrown out, and they're replaced by right-wing toadies. So that the police is just bracketed as something that you could potentially use against the Nazis. And so part of the pusillanimity of the military in 1933 and 1934 has to do with the fear that they might not be able to do it. That fear should not exist in the United States. I tried to find out the number of people in paramilitary groups in the United States. And first of all, the numbers of them, of the groups themselves, have fallen from a little over 300 to now it's something like 52, which could, however, indicate consolidation and not vociferation. But the actual numbers, most people appear to believe that the numbers, that N is like 20,000. So I doubled that in my own thinking, figuring that it would be better to err on that side than the other side. That's nothing. There are 500,000 active Army members, and that's and that's not even counting then the Navy and the Air Force. I mean, it's just not comparable. So that from the standpoint of a civil war in this kind, I mean, we could talk about that, but it doesn't look the same as in Weimar or in early Nazi Germany. It's just doesn't look the same. So
can I press you on that?
Sure.
On that one. Okay, I get the numbers, but I wonder about the potential for mobilization. I mean, this country is armed to the teeth, right? And there is a lot of very violent rhetoric. I was reading recently about this new apostolic reformation tour that it took place across the country this summer. And if you look into it, the language is, we're going to prepare for war. These are these pastors, these charismatic pastors, the Lance Waldows and the Mario Murillos. I'm on the earth to be armed and dangerous. We have to be ready to act. So look, I know you don't have a crystal ball, and it's not really, in some ways, it's not really fair to ask you to make predictions, but there seems to me to be the great potential for very rapid mobilization, especially given the kinds of communications technology we have now and the number of weapons sloshing around in the country. Does that seem to be an operative difference for you?
It's not an operative difference, but it's a very good point. In fact, the social media can, in fact, motivate people real fast. And it's certainly true, we are awash with guns and of a military grade, but of course, so is the Weimar Republic. All that stuff was hidden, and there's a wonderful report from the Inter-Allied Military Control Commission from 1925, which is hair-raising if you read. It's 500 pages of basically weapons caches here and there and every place. So from that perspective, the Weimar Republic was really well armed. And all of these paramilitary guys, or most of them, the overwhelming number of them, had combat experience. I mean, they actually knew what they were doing. But you're certainly right. If the question is, could you mobilize a bunch of people fast? You might be able to do that, but it still would not present the same military problem that the Weimar Reichswehr faced, just in terms of numbers. The historians have thought that maybe one of the possible things that could have saved the Republic was during that 1932 coup in Prussia, if the socialists had actually fought, which certainly the young socialists wanted to do, and a number of people in the Social Democratic Party wanted to do, but the trade unions didn't want to do. And the army had been forced to come in. Would that have produced a kind of military dictatorship, which wouldn't have been pretty, but it wouldn't have been the Third Reich. And it would not have started World War II, at least not until the 1950s. And it wouldn't have had the eradication of the Jews on its escutcheon. And it would have been, almost anything would have been better, but it would have been better. And that's one of the counterfactuals that people often sort of think about as a potential. But in fact, what the socialists did, as you know, was they filed a lawsuit. And the court basically, they said a few of the points of the lawsuit were correct, but on the whole, no. And that was that. So, and the courts are another thing we could talk about, although I'm not supposed to. I'm supposed to talk about the military.
Well, you mentioned the Jews, and I wanted to bring anti-Semitism into the conversation. It was a long time ago that the Israeli historian Shulamit Volkov talked about anti-Semitism in the Weimar context as okay, it wasn't a big vote getter in elections when there were free elections in the Republic, but it was a cultural code, right? A kind of glue that could unite or bring together, at least to some extent, various factions, various kinds of different groups. And I wonder if you see any parallels in the contemporary American context. I wonder if that's a possible point of comparison, or it's one of those that it just seems too different. I mean, there's so much anti-Semitism on the far left. There's anti-Semitism the far right is laced with anti-Semitism, but it's not just the extremes. I mean, we see it in other places also. Is there a point of comparison to be made there, or too different?
There is, because anti-Semitism is widespread enough and has been for such a very long time that it's a known, recognizable, genuine thing, which is certainly comparable, if not identical. What I don't see, there are absolutely clearly neo-Nazi groups in the United States which are absolutely as rabidly anti-Semitic as Hitler was, and the most extreme anti-Semites of the Nazi movement. They do exist, and they are organized, and they are active in social media, and the Turner diaries and all of this nonsense, it's all widespread, and to return to your phrase, mobilization, that potential
Mhm.
is certainly there. And that certainly exists. If we were to turn back to the Army, the US Army has perhaps belatedly, but nevertheless, finally become interested in the problem of right wing, and that includes anti-Semitic soldiers in the Army, and actually does attempt to do how successful they are, I don't know, but they're at least doing something and they're aware of the problem. In the German Army, anti-Semitism, in my view, I actually think that that Hitler, gets the seeds of his anti-Semitism, as is well known in Vienna, but it really flowers at division headquarters during World War I. And that's really when it's the loss of World War I and the emotional effort to digest that and blame somebody else that really does it. And the military plays a large role in that, in fact. And the military, in my view, is actually transformed during World War I, at least, and that's a sign of it. That's one of the signs of it. The military that comes out of 1918 is not the military that went in 1914. It is radically different. And as far as I can tell, and our military is aware of and this goes back to Timothy McVeigh. I mean, that was when it became clear that there is a potential that the Army attracts people who are far right-wing crackpots and who are dangerous. And from that time on, the Army has become somewhat more sensitive to this. Again, if you were to take somebody like Gröner, he did not want the Army to drift. He wanted the Army to be absolutely state-oriented. Yeah. And you all probably know that Hitler, on the whole, in his speeches, while he was pursuing the path of legality, unquote, tended not to talk all that much about the Jews and anti-Semitic stuff, because it didn't play all that well. It didn't get the audience response that he wanted. He never abandoned any of it, but he just simply didn't talk about it that much. And that's one of the sad parts about all of that stuff is all it takes is for you to sit with your laps in your hands and permit bad things to happen. You don't really have to participate in them to have them occur. And that's what happened in that. So.
Well, I wonder, this takes us a little bit out of our topic, but I wonder if the recent experience in Germany, the revelations of right-wing infiltration of elite combat units, and this is something that historian Esther Adair has written about recently, might be instructive, as much as the Germans screwed up, I hate to say, in this area for the U.S. military. But that's
absolutely, and the same thing is true, by the way, for police forces and sheriffs and the rest. I mean, this is part of it has to do, I think, with just the type of person who it tends to gravitate toward those kinds of professions, and then it's rather easy to because there is a history and you can see how these things might develop, and it would be interesting. I don't know how successful programs against this are. I mean, is it the kind of thing that people then go underground? Is it the kind of thing that people say, oh no, another, session of brotherly love and that kind of thing? I simply don't know, but it is true that the U.S. Army is at least cognizant
Yeah.
of this problem, which is good.
Well, then in terms of acts of political violence, going back to a comment you made during your comments, you noted, you talked about whether or not the individual, the perpetrator had a military background or not, were acting as individuals. And I wonder if I could just push you on that, because that got me thinking of the whole myth of the lone wolf, which is still, I think, taken, especially on the conservative side in the United States, as well, Timothy McVeigh was a lone wolf, or if you broaden it internationally, Breivik was a lone wolf. They weren't lone wolves, just like somebody like an Arco Valley in the Weimar period wasn't really a lone wolf. They acted alone at that moment, but they are enmeshed in this larger culture. Is that another point where there might be a useful comparison to be made?
I think the point is very good that actually the media savvy right-wing and Islamicist and certain other groups are certainly targeting lone wolves and feeding them and hoping that they will do stuff. And that gives you deniability, and it's harder for the police forces and the rest to do something about that and the rest. And so it's very clear that they've understood that, and they're running with that ball. That's right.
Yeah.
I still think that, I mean, what do you do with with the first shooter from Butler, Pennsylvania? What do you do with a guy like that? How do you analyze that? And if you look at the and I looked at the statistics, and I was struck by the very large percentage of the that, and I've somewhere I can find it for you if you want. There are a number of really interesting social, civil social groups that are active out there looking at these kinds of things. And one of them is very interested in motivation of perpetrators of political violence. And what is very striking about their research is the large percentage of unknowns where you simply can't figure it out. It's unclear. The information won't do it for you. And I'm sensitive to that, and I don't want to draw a bunch of conclusions on a bunch of faulty or unclear evidence from that. And there's also we don't call it anarchism, which is kind of interesting. Instead, we call it individualism. But in the United States, has a kind of longish history of, pardon the technical term, crackpots going out and doing stuff on their own and without being part of any particular organized groups. And it is well known that Germany is, in general, a much better organized place in every respect, including civil society. And of course, that was one of the ways that the Third Reich very quickly grew big, was by targeting the heads of organizations or particular elites in a village and the rest, and they then brought their followers and members of their clubs in with them. And so that's one of the reasons that when you take a look at the Nazi, the sort of the graph, it goes boom like this, and the only way that can happen is with prior organization. And just or it's certainly not to that extent. That's would be my response.
Well, I could certainly keep going, but I don't want to overtax our audience. John, would this be a good time to open the floor. Okay, yeah, well, maybe this would be terrific. I'd love to take. And if you wouldn't mind identifying
dear.
yourselves, that would be terrific. Maybe we could start with David Abraham.
Thank you very much. Two questions, if I may. One specific to the late Weimar situation and the role of generals in the military as an alternative to civil war, and that is the Schleicher interlude, which you passed over kind of quickly, and it remains kind of puzzling, but if you would say something about that. And then the comparative issue of when conservative parties I don't want to say make alliances, but find themselves on good terms with these extreme right-wing movements. So in the German case, you mentioned September 1930, but I think you can trace the legitimation of the Harzburg Front people, Stahlhelm, and Nazis in elite and conservative circles. And everyone's talking about how the Republican Party has increasingly integrated the most crackpot, not organized as Stahlhelm, et cetera, were. But what are the analogies you see with conservatives propping up support by integrating or turning to these mass right-wing?
I think there's a lot, and I have not wanted to trespass on the following two presentations, but I actually think that there's a whole bunch there, and the exact comparison that I would use would be the German National People's Party, the DNVP, and sections of the DVP, the German People's Party, and their, sort of off again, on again flirtations with the Nazis and acceptance of the Nazis, and then the Harzburg Front, and all of that. And you're absolutely right. I think the Republican Party has thrown its arms around all kinds of groups that that General Eisenhower wouldn't have approved of. Let's go back to him. I mean, everybody likes to go back to Reagan. I would prefer to go back to Eisenhower. So I agree with that. I think you could do a lot with that. And there's no question that the interesting thing about the Republican Party is that it had to traverse a larger path to get there. The DNVP hardly had to move at all. I mean, it was not in favor of the Republic from the beginning, and the DVP had a larger path to do, but it managed to do that without too much trouble. But the DNVP was opposed to the Republic from the beginning, and it was just, for them, it was really a question of what are you going to substitute for it and how are you going to do it? But boom, that otherwise. And then Hugenberg, the head of that, at the end just sort of poops out and lets Hitler run with the ball, which is also interesting to me. And you know that the parties essentially folded. The KPD was outlawed, but the SPD finally was outlawed. But actually the parties self-dissolve, and that's a really, really interesting process. And that self-dissolution should be something that somebody should look at. That's a really, really interesting comparison with what the Republican Party has done. And there is a long history of this. And it reminds me of the graph that I have somewhere here, but you don't have to see it, where the destruction of the German middle class through the inflation goes like boom, like that, just right off the cliff, right? The American destruction of the middle class, which is to say the bringing of the middle class down to the same level as essentially the working class, goes over 40 years. That ends up very close. The end point on the graph is very, very close, but it took 40 years to get there. And the Republican Party has also step by step without, actually, I don't think it knew what it was doing. I think it made one step and another. And then moved in the direction that the DNVP was born with, so to speak. So that there is that difference, and it's that lengthy path that I think is really fascinating from that perspective. But what was your first question? Schleicher and Civil War. Schleicher, who, as everyone points out, lived down to his name. It means, you know, sort of creeper and nasty little behind backstabber and that kind of thing. Yeah, it couldn't, if somebody had made up that in a Hollywood film, everyone would say, no. But it's really true. His attempt, insofar as I can make sense of it, because in fact, he moves around and he stabs so many people in the back, he just sort of begins to look like a mass murderer and not like a planner. But I think that there was a plan in the beginning, and that plan was to bump off the KPD and then split the Nazi Party and produce a presidial government, which would either stay with a president or and some other people would have liked to have brought the Crown Prince in. And certainly the Crown Prince was part of his circle, or at least was talking to him behind the scenes and stuff like this. What he did not want was a civil war, very clearly. And again, none of the people in the military want a civil war. And I think that truly the main reason for that is that they think that they won't be able to control it or win. And actually, I have to say, I think they were right. Yeah.
Esther Adair had a question here.
Thank you. Hi, yeah, Esther Adair, NYPD Counterterrorism Bureau. I'm so glad you brought up the example of the Butler PA shooter. Since you mentioned lone offenders right at the beginning of your talk, I've been thinking of him as the main example of this kind of ideologically unaffiliated grievance aggregator, who I can tell you is the #1 politically motivated violent offender, stumping counterterrorism professionals right now. I'm wondering, with that in mind, and given that you also mentioned social media very briefly once or twice, how might you compare the fragility of the Weimar democracy with our own current democratic moment, and keeping in mind also things like the information landscape? Are we currently so fragile and so inundated with information in a way that's comparable or actually extremely different?
That's a very good question. The main thing that looks to me the same is the stovepiping of the media, which in both cases was self-done. People, in the Weimar Republic, the newspapers lined up with parties, and people tended not to read the newspapers from parties that they were not in favor of or members of or whatever. And so the this kind of stovepiping meant that people were not necessarily aware of all of the things that they should have been aware of, or that would have been good if they had been aware of them, because they were not reported in their newspaper, or their newspapers would give a different gloss on it that would. And there are exceptions to this. By the time you get into 1932, I think the tendency was for papers actually to do a slightly better job at reporting what was going on, because people were really nervous about it, and the rest. But nevertheless, what you do have is really big divisions. in the population, which, you know, sort of from a too easy perspective, is, you know, working class, bourgeoisie, Bildungsbürger, Adel, you know, that kind of thing. And when you say working class, really that split should be the organized working class versus that part of the working class that was not organized in the social democratic trade unions. And those people actually were more free floating in politics. But that thing, I think, is very much the same in terms of the informational landscape that people faced. In terms of being overwhelmed with information or with what I think people in the Weimar Republic at the end felt is what I feel like in the United States, and that is, it's just constant politics. It just drives you crazy, and you just want to get away from it. And so I have, you know, been oscillating between thinking I'm living in 1932 or living in 1939. Neither one was a good year, you know. And I think that the American habit of having actually interminable electioneering is dreadful. I think it wears everybody out. It's exhausting, it's expensive, it's stupid, and you know, it makes me long for a parliamentary system, which they don't do that, and that's smart. But we have what we have, so.
Atina Grossman.
Thank you. Thank you, Itzi. Before you just said that, I was going to say that I wasn't sure whether you were making me feel better or worse, but now I know I feel worse. But I actually had two sort of more, you know, less dramatic questions, maybe. One is that when you were talking about, you know, the differences in the power or the range of the left. I just wanted to go back to that old question that always gets posed as a counterfactual, which showed up on your slide briefly about, you know, the Reichsbanner, right, which was very large and armed. And would, you know, and we have nothing approaching that, right? I mean, would that, to what degree does that old argument about, oh, if only the Reichsbanner, you know, had acted, sort of fit into your sort of analysis of what could have happened, didn't happen, work in terms of the comparison? So that's sort of one question. And the other question sort of occurred to me when you were talking about the vast difference in, you know, the size, you know, the sizes of the military. That, I mean, you know, I mean, the American military is not only much larger, but it's also, you know, very multiracial. It's, you know, filled with immigrants and lots of diverse groups, from Native Americans to African Americans, et cetera. And I'm wondering, again, that was clearly not true with either German, you know, with the German military. So that, how do you see that maybe playing into potential work to be done in terms of, okay, now it comes time to do that domestic security action of deporting 1 million people. Does that play into the comparison, that these are also demographically very different? So two kind of different questions, but.
Right. The Reichsbanner, again, the thing, well, the thing that turned out to be most effective that the SPD did wasn't with the Reichsbanner, it was with when the trade unions went on strike in 1920. And that really ended the Kapp-Putsch. That was the end. And it helped that the military was split, but anyhow, which in a way you can say they created the vacuum into which the general strike came, and then that was the end. The Reichsbanner, action by the Reichsbanner would have presented the military with the question, how do we respond? And they could have responded either that and it would then depend, would it be the Reichsbanner against the SA or the Jungdeutscher Orden or the Stahlhelm, or what would it have been? That would have made a lot of difference in how the military went in. And then you're back to the 1932 kind of thinking, which is that if the army did go in, then certain things would have been cleared up, and you might have had an army dictatorship, but that would have been, in with 2020 hindsight, better than what happened. Could the Reichsbanner have beaten all these other guys? No, I don't think so. Or certainly you really would have had a civil war then, and it would have been real nasty. And that would have drawn the military in. Whether they could have handled that or not isn't clear. And then you have to, it's interesting to think about what would the Rotfront Kämpferbund have done in this, and it's hard to say because, their chief enemy was the SPD. And so you just start to get into this Alice in Wonderland kind of counterfactual thing that you really can't think your way through. It's just, you can kind of set it up, but it immediately becomes chaotic, and it's hard to know. And the second thing was, oh yes, our army, which is nicely differentiated in sociological terms, which is good. But the only thing that stops me from leaping with joy and heaving a sigh of relief about that is the Tyre-Nichols case, with 4 African-American policemen who behaved like violent policemen against an African-American man. And again, the training that you get in the military and in the militarized police, which is what the United States has, not all police forces are like that, but ours tends to be. Your training it's quite possible for that to overcome other sociological factors that one would think, would be paramount in that. And you shouldn't discount that. That, after all, is what militaries, especially militaries, are put on earth to do. They are put on earth to train people so well that in really, really terrible situations where you are perhaps about to die, you will do the thing that the military organization needs you to do. So you need to be really, really well trained for that. And your muscle memory has to be really good. And that can overcome a whole lot of sociological factors. And I'm just incapable of knowing because I'm not an American historian. So the US military I know something about, but not nearly enough to be able to pontificate on, what might happen in that regard.
So I have to point, I don't know your name, but if it's all right, Luke, right here.
I'm Carol Gluck. I'm neither a German nor an American historian, so forgive my question. I'm really struck by focusing on consolidation and Gleichschaltung. And for example, Project 2025. I'm thinking now, maybe we shouldn't be talking about Weimar and democracy then and democracy here. More we should be talking about all the things that have been done. Let's call them preparation or pre-preparation for the kind of consolidation that Project 2025 is proposing. In other words, there's a lot of things that are already underway. They've been underway for a very long time, different times. But so maybe I'm thinking we should be looking not at Weimar and how that collapsed, but what were the threads that were already there that made Gleichschaltung work? Now, you've already mentioned some of them. So maybe the comparison we need to be thinking about is exactly what you say, not Weimar democracy or the Republic, but how did that Gleichschaltung come to be, and how was it that these people folded and that, et cetera? And on that, my question is to you. You explained how Hitler comes in and decapitates the leadership, let's say, of the. Why doesn't Project 2025 enable the putative Trump government to just cashier all the Mark Millies and put in their people?
Yeah,
So
no,
why
that's-
isn't that. Why doesn't that work? You were
How would
defending
that?
the American military, and I'm saying, how can you defend the American military and its apolitical nature if their leadership
No,
is?
absolutely, that's absolutely right. And I would say that the main strand that we need to look at in the United States is the enormous expansion of presidential power over decades, the imperial presidency. That has prepared us for sliding in a way that would not have been true.
Greatly bolstered by the Supreme Court.
And bolstered by the Supreme Court. You know, that's, I quite agree that there's been an enormous preparation for this that has been unconscious. Again, I think it's like one foot in front of the other, and you respond to this problem and you respond this way. So that's part of that. Part of that is the paralysis, in some cases, the self-paralysis of Congress. There is the preparation concerning not just the Supreme Court, but the whole appellate court structure, which begins at a minimum in 1982 with the founding of the Federalist Society, which had set as its goal at that time putting like-minded originalists and whatever else you might call them into positions in the judiciary. And of course, that's exactly what President Trump did in the 4 years in which he was in office. So that, yes, there's a very, very, you know, there's a long series of things that have to do with all three branches of government, which have culminated in Project 2025.
The preparation.
Yes, you can. You can, and the place, and again, I'm sorry to step on the toes of the people who are coming after me, that the main preparation there is different from here, insofar as the majority of the parties were already opposed to the Republic and wanted something else. And what exactly it was they wanted could be a presidial kind of thing where with a reduced Reichstag or a Reichstag that was, as in the imperial period, separated from the government. The government is here, the Reichstag is here. So there is one, and they can talk and they can do stuff, but they don't actually govern in that respect. Or you bring back the Kaiser, but not Wilhelm, but the Crown Prince or whatever. And so they have a series of different alternatives. But the main thing that they agreed on was that the Republic was bad and that it was an un-German form of government, that it was foisted upon Germany by its enemies, and that it was unsuitable for Germany. And in terms of the army, the unsuitability of it they could overlook because it was in fact suitable for rearmament, and that's what they wanted. And that's in fact what there was a significant amount of rearmament under the Weimar Republic. Part of it done in the Soviet Union and part of it surreptitiously in Germany. So if you rephrase the question, you ask, why is it that people were permitted themselves to put up with the violence and the consolidation and the murders and this and that and the other? They had things to gain. They had things to fear. The overlap between the first part of the Nazi program and what these people wanted was pretty good. And their imaginations appear to have been incapable of grasping that that was just the beginning of the Nazi program and that it was going to go way far off the deep end, and which most Germans were not in favor of. They didn't want a war. They wanted to get it. They wanted to get back the stuff that the Treaty of Versailles had taken away, as it were, for free, without fighting a war for it. And when Hitler embarks on the war, he does that. The general staff is horrified, and so is the population for a while. And then when the war goes well at first, people, are prepared to put up with it. It's the same business of being prepared to put up with things because of your own self-perception of what it is that you need, what it is that you want, what it is you can afford, all of these nasty little calculations that we all go through. I mean, we all do this. And anyway, that's what I'd say.
One more? Can we?
No,
push on
sure.
you?
Yeah, yeah.
One more question. Andy Robinbach. Sorry, we couldn't get to anybody, but everybody, but
I wonder if it's useful to think about the interaction between planned and unplanned events. Because the Reichstag fire, for all the good that it did Hitler, was probably unplanned. And that strikes me as important because you need a precipitating event, and that can't be predicted. The other thing is about the Reichstag fire. The trial of the Reichstag defendants, who were all communists, one social democrat, ended in acquittal for all of them. Only van der Lubbe was convicted. That was unpredicted. Goebbels and Goering spoke at the trial.
Yes, and in fact, there is a nice alternate history of, for example, there's a very nice book on a district attorney in Munich who investigated murders in Dachau in the beginning. There is a nice book on Müssingen, which wasn't putting up with any of this stuff in Schwaben. And so there are examples in Germany of folks who did the right thing. And the Nazis dealt with that kind of thing in interesting ways. They didn't just go like that. They went around, they went under, they went over, they waited. There was the Third Reich was a much more malleable, kind of amoeba-like thing that than its caricature. And that was very successful. And especially it was successful in the period before, in the mind of somebody like Hitler, who was really, really radical, until that period before they would actually win, at which point all bets were going to be off. But up until that time, there was a lot of flexibility in the way that the Third Reich went about dealing with dissatisfaction and actually outright rejection and the rest. It's actually interesting. I mean, again, the Third Reich didn't last as long as the Weimar Republic. If you think about that, it's just look at all the stuff that it permanently destroyed in the process. But it was a remarkably flexible, almost it had a kind of a biological quality that it kind of it moved and reacted in very nuanced and often. It could be absolutely brutal, but it could be these other things as well. And that's useful to remember when we try to think about consolidation, because in fact, it's the two things. It's not just the legality and the illegality and violence at the same time. It's also this very flexible, clever manipulation of folks, both in terms of positive propaganda and this other kind of moving and going around. Because, for example, this DA from Munich, he wasn't killed. He was just kind of sidelined. They just kind of went around him, and that was the sort of the governing mechanism of the Third Reich. Really was to kind of let everything kind of compete against each other and the rest, and then Hitler would in the end kind of put funnel resources to the one that he thought was doing the best job, and the rest of them would sort of fall away. And it's in that respect, it's a really fascinating governmental structure, and it's unlike anything that I've ever seen anywhere else. And so that's absolutely right, that there was a lot more slippage and stuff that went on that was actually part of the way the Third Reich programmatically operated. That's it.
Thank you.
I'm at the end of my lap.